In the last lecture, we talked about this utilitarian approach to punishment. I sketched the basic utilitarian approach. There's a lot going on there, but hopefully you guys got it. The idea is deterrence, right? And, more punishment, more deterrence, but you do run into this phenomenon of diminishing returns. And for some crimes, you pretty rapidly hit a point where more punishment isn't worth it. For others, because the crime itself does so much damage, creates so much unhappiness, that point comes later, right? But eventually for any crime, you hit a point where more deterrence simply isn't worth the cost, both in pain to the criminal and in cost to society for what you have to pay for the punishment itself. Okay, so let's talk about the specific issues that they talk about in the Hi-Fi Nation episode, at least from a utilitarian lens. So what would a utilitarian say about cases like Marilyn's? Remember, Marilyn was this woman who shoplifts, gets sent to the chain gang, I think, for several years, at least a very long sentence. Not only is she sent to the chain gang, she now has this criminal record that makes it very, very difficult, practically impossible for her to find gainful employment, right? And because she can't find gainful, honest employment, she keeps going back to shoplift. What would a utilitarian say about this? Is the way that Marilyn was treated justifiable for a utilitarian? Think about that for a second, yes or no. Well, no, right? I mean, look. Shoplifting is pretty much the definition of a crime that's pretty minor in the damage it does, right? No one is traumatized by shoplifting. Except my wife had to put up with this woman shoplifting from the anthropology. She was very annoyed, right? It's not like being physically attacked, right? The damage it does to the store, it hurts their bottom line, right? But, it's not that big, right? It hurts other customers because, it's overly simplistic to say the cost of shoplifting has to be passed along. It isn't always right, but it does lead to maybe some higher prices, right? Other annoyances, so on and so forth, right? But really, shoplifting, we should pay some to deter it, right? We shouldn't just have a world where people can steal whatever they want from stores. Obviously, that would have bad consequences. But on the other hand, the point you hit where more deterrence isn't worth it for shoplifting is going to come pretty soon. And it almost certainly comes way before you get to the point of sending shoplifters off to the chain gang, right? I'm guessing very short jail sentences, a few weeks, a month tops, are going to be enough to where more deterrence isn't worth it for shoplifting, right? I don't know where the exact point is, but it's going to come way before sending someone off to the chain gang, right? The misery you're going to inflict on them isn't worth it. More cold-bloodedly, the cost of putting someone up on a chain gang in prison isn't worth it, right? So almost certainly this punishment, the punishment that was inflicted on Marilyn, is a bad punishment for a utilitarian. It's too harsh. It costs too much. It's not worth it. You would create more happiness if you had a lighter punishment for this crime. Also, think about this, right? The whole point of punishment for a utilitarian, maybe not the whole point, but most of it, over 90% of the point of punishment for a utilitarian is deterrence. Well, it's super counterproductive if your punishment makes it more likely that the criminal, him or herself, will reoffend, right? It's supposed to prevent crime if it's actually causing it to be more likely that the criminal will reoffend. That's just crazy for a utilitarian, right? Putting this woman, Marilyn, in a position where she's forced into crime, or even where it's very difficult for her not to resort to crime, and putting other people in these positions for a utilitarian is just utterly perverse, right? Just, you are, by the nature of the punishment, making more crime happen, making these people more likely to reoffend. That's just crazy for a utilitarian, right? So look, a utilitarian would say, prison's not supposed to be fun, right? I mean, it wouldn't be a punishment if it's fun. But there's really good evidence that giving prisoners job training and education reduces reoffense. So a utilitarian would say, we need to do a whole lot more to train prisoners for jobs. We need to do a whole lot more to give prisoners chances to educate themselves. If that reduces reoffense, if that makes it less likely that this person will commit a crime when they get out, for a utilitarian, it's just obvious we should do that. Now, there's other things like, so-called ban the box. That being, people don't, it's banned that employers ask criminals about their criminal records. I think a utilitarian on the whole would support things like that. Here you get into complicated issues of what to do if the crime, damage certain people might be more prone to do if they're in certain positions, right? I don't know. I wouldn't want anybody who's ever convicted of a violent crime to be a police officer, right? I wouldn't want to give that person the ability to use violence on others. Maybe I'm wrong about that. That just seems, I don't know, that seems dangerous, right? I wouldn't want to give Bernie Madoff or somebody else who's defrauded people of their investments, I wouldn't want them to ever again have a job in the financial industry, right? If someone, has committed sexual offenses, there are probably certain jobs we really want to keep them away from, right? Just in terms of consequences. So I'm not sure if a good utilitarian approach would be to say, let's ban all, employers from ever asking employees about their criminal records. There might be legitimate cases where that's relevant, right? On the other hand, there are a lot of cases where it's not, right? If you get busted for some kind of drug offense as a 19-year-old, is that really going to impact your ability to work at Kroger, right? Heck, I mean, I was never busted for a drug offense, but if you get busted for a drug offense, would that impact your ability to be, say, a philosophy professor or a teacher? I don't really know, right? Especially at such a young age, there doesn't seem much reason to think that, right? If you're shoplifting at a young age, like Marilyn was, is there any reason to think that tells us anything about whether you're likely to not do a good job as a secretary, right? Or not do a good job as a waitress or something. I'm really skeptical about that, right? So in a lot of cases, I do think utilitarians would support a lot more restrictions on forcing people to tell about criminal records, especially for crimes they commit in the past, and especially for crimes that aren't at all relevant to the jobs they're doing, right? You know, we don't want child molesters working in daycare. On the other hand, who cares if someone who was once caught with a joint is stocking your groceries at Harris Teeter or even teaching your class, right? Again, I've never, ever been charged with a drug crime. I just personally do think you could be a perfectly fine philosophy professor or English professor or math professor if you had been caught in a drug offense at some point in the past, right? Anyway, so lots more job training, and I think, more restrictions, maybe not an outright ban on ever looking at criminal records for employment, but a lot more restrictions in asking about that. I think those are both pretty clear for utilitarians. Would utilitarianism support prison abolition? A lot of the people that Lamb talks to in the Hi-Fi Nation episode seem to think so. Prison abolition meaning we get rid of prisons, we treat criminals basically as people who have problems, who need counseling or support or whatever. We don't punish them, right? I'm not so sure that a utilitarian would do that. To me, there certainly just seem to be crimes that people know better, and the only way to stop them is probably punishment, right? If you park in a handicapped spot, you know better. It's not like we're going to give you a stern talking to or whatever, and you're going to see the light, right? The main way to keep people who would park in handicapped spots from doing that is to give them a big old fine when they do that, right? In the same way, I'm not sure that by definition anyone who steals money from somebody or hits another person or whatever is in need of help, right? You look at Bernie Madoff, who stole people's life savings. Something's wrong with Bernie Madoff, right? You've got to have a deeply warped character to do this to people. I don't think Bernie Madoff just is mentally ill in any sense or suffers from some kind of trauma. He just needs some counseling, right? I think he's just a bad person. And probably the way you're going to deter guys like Madoff is just by making it so it's not worth their time to steal, right? So I'm very, very skeptical that a utilitarian would say get rid of punishment and to treat criminals as in need of help. I think a utilitarian would say a lot of criminals maybe should be treated that way, right? And that seems clear, right? There are a lot of people in our prisons who have mental illnesses. Schizophrenia untreated, bipolar disorder untreated. Utilitarian would definitely say we shouldn't punish these people, or probably shouldn't, right? To the extent their mental illness is the cause of their crime. They need treatment. But I think a utilitarian would say, there are some people out there who are perfectly sane that the only way you're going to get them to behave decently is the threat of punishment. So for that reason, I'm very skeptical that a utilitarian would be for full-on abolition. But I think it's very clear that a utilitarian would say two things. One, a lot of our crimes, we could have lighter punishments for them. We pay too much for the amount of deterrence we get for this specific crime. I'm not a criminologist, so I'm not going to go through the list. But, we'll talk about this in the next unit. Drug crimes especially, right? Do we really need to be sending people to jail 10 years or life for nonviolent drug dealing? Is that worth it for the amount of deterrence it gets? I don't think so, right? So I think we would have to look at our system and ask ourselves, is this punishment worth what we're paying for it, both in pain to the criminal and larger social consequences? And you have to factor in not just what we pay for it, but what the criminal's family and community suffer for the criminal being punished, right? So a good utilitarian approach, I doubt, would lead to abolition. It would lead to lighter punishments for many crimes. A utilitarian would also support much more support and help for criminals than we give them now. Much more training in prison, much more educational opportunities, not just sort of kick this guy to the curb when his sentence is over, let him struggle to reintegrate himself into society. Would also probably want to put some restrictions on the things that make it harder for criminals to get non-criminal employment, probably some real restrictions on what employers can ask about criminal records.